Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Beware the Blob. Now, this movie also goes by the title Son of the Blob, and it's also been known under the title The Blob Returns. Now, this came out in 1972, and this, of course, is the sequel to the 1958 cult classic, The Blob. Now, Beware the Blob was actually directed by actor Larry Hagman. Now, I know Larry Hagman would go on to play a major character on the show Dallas. Now, I'll admit, I've never watched a single episode of Dallas, and if I have, I don't remember it, and I know Dallas was like a huge show, and on the show Dallas, Larry Hagman played a character named JR, who I know at a certain point on the show, somebody tries to kill him, and that's like a big question on the show is, who shot JR? So, with the popularity of Dallas, later releases of this movie would have the tagline, "The movie that JR shot." Now, I know a lot of people don't like this movie, and I could totally get why some people don't like this film, but I personally adore this movie. And I'll admit, a lot of my love for this movie really is nostalgia, because this movie actually does hold a lot of sentimental value for me. I actually first saw this movie when I was 9 years old, but I saw it under the title Son of the Blob. AMC was actually playing it late one Friday night, and this was back when AMC was a legit movie channel, back when they used to run movies uncut and without commercials. But that's how I first saw the movie. I saw it under the title Son of the Blob. And then years later, when I was 12 going on 13, I was in a Suncoast video store, and I came across a copy of this movie under the title Beware the Blob, and I didn't even realize that this was the same movie. I thought this was like another Blob movie, and at the time, I didn't understand the concept of alternate titles. So, I ended up buying this movie, and when I watched it, I was like, wait a minute, this is the same movie I saw when I was 9 years old. And I used to watch this movie all the time when I was 13 years old, and this is a movie that really does hold a lot of sentimental value for me. And once again, it's not a particularly great movie. It's certainly not as good as the original The Blob, but it's a movie I have a lot of fun with, and I'll admit, a lot of my love for this movie probably is just nostalgia, but I still really enjoy the film. Honestly, I find this to be really funny. Now, I mentioned in my review of The Blob that The Blob had a lot of humor in it, but I would not call it a full-fledged horror comedy. This one I would definitely call a horror comedy. This movie almost plays out like a parody of the first movie. Now, the plot of Beware the Blob is it's supposed to be set years and years after the events of the first movie. However, you could debate on whether or not this is actually set in the same universe as the first movie because of a certain thing that you see in this movie, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's supposed to be years and years after the events of the original The Blob. Now, at the end of the first movie, you found out that there was no known way to kill the blob. The only way to stop it was to freeze it, and at the very end of that movie, you realize that the main characters have called the National Guard in, and you see them drop the blob somewhere in the North Pole. So, in the beginning of this movie, you follow a character named Chester, who you realize has been gone for a couple of months now, and he was up in the North Pole laying down a pipeline, and one of his bulldozer men pushed something right out of the snow. And you're supposed to assume that it was the blob from the first movie, and he takes a sample of it back home and puts it in his freezer. His wife takes it out of the freezer, and then it thaws out and eats their cat, and then eats the wife, and then it eats Chester. The movie starts following this young woman named Lisa, who is a friend of Chester and his wife, and recently Chester's wife and her made a present for her boyfriend Bobby, Bobby, and she goes to their house to pick up the present, and then she witnesses Chester get killed by the Blob. So Lisa goes to get her boyfriend Bobby, and he of course doesn't believe her until later on in the film when he too sees the Blob and just barely escapes from it. But basically throughout the movie, Lisa is trying to warn people about this creature, and of course nobody will believe her, and throughout the film the Blob eats more people, and the more it eats, the bigger it gets. And that's the basic plot line of Beware the Blob, or Son of the Blob, or The Blob Returns, whichever you want to call it. Now, the reason I said it's debatable whether or not this is actually set in the same universe as the first movie is because there's actually a scene in this movie where Chester is watching the original The Blob, and it's sort of like a fourth wall breaking kind of thing.
We saw it again in Dad's store. Dave, it's bigger now.
Your story's gotten bigger now, kid.
Dave, look at me. Do I look like somebody who's playing a practical joke? Am I laughing? Or am I scared still?
It was sort of like meta before meta was really a thing. Now, in the movie, Gwen Gilford plays the character of Lisa, and Robert Walker plays the character of Bobby, and both of them do pretty decent jobs in this movie for the kind of movie that it is. I mean, none of the acting in this movie is necessarily Oscar caliber by any means, but they both do pretty good jobs in the film, and they're both likable in their roles. In the movie, you also have a character named Sheriff Jones, played by Richard Webb, who I thought was a really awesome character because he's like the sheriff of this small town, but he's such a laid-back sheriff, and he was a really likable character, and he actually reminded me a lot of the character of Lieutenant Dave from the first movie. In the movie, you have a character named Edward Fazio, played by Richard Stahl, and his character was such a douchebag in this movie. Like, he's arguably an antagonist in the film, not an antagonist in the same way that the Blob is an antagonist. Like, he's not necessarily evil, he's just a real asshole, and he's constantly being an asshole to Bobby and Lisa in the film, but his character also adds a lot of humor to the movie. There are also some actors in this movie who were either really well known for the time this movie came out, or would go on to become really well known, who either have cameos in this movie or small bit parts in the film. For example, Dick Van Patten has a very small role in this movie as a scoutmaster.
Would you stop that infernal noise now and go build a tent?
Also, Gerrit Graham, who most people would recognize from movies like Phantom of the Paradise and Child's Play 2, he has a small role in this movie as a character named Joe, who is a real douchebag, and throughout the whole movie, he's wearing a King Kong outfit.
Alright, get out.
Alright, I will.
Creep.
Also, I shit you not, Burgess Meredith actually has a brief cameo appearance in this movie as this hobo who hates hippies, and apparently the only reason he was even in this movie was because him and Larry Hagman were neighbors at the time.
I hate hippies. I hate hippies! They ruin all of us.
The trouble with you is you're hostile.
I'm hostile?
You're basically hostile.
Kiss me.
That was a hostile gesture disguised in the language. You are hostile. You've been attacking me ever since we opened the bottle.
You're a half-tailed philosopher.
Yeah.
Also, Sid Haig has a very small role in this movie as this douchebag cop, and he's literally only in one scene in the movie, and this was before Sid Haig would go on to become the cult icon that most horror fans think of him as. And also, I've been watching this movie for years, and I just recently found out that that was Sid Haig. I never knew that was him, because he's so young in the movie, and also when you see him, he's kind of like in the shadows, so I barely recognized him as Sid Haig.
It's only me. Hey, Sims, there's a call for assistance on the radio. We'd better drop this.
Drop this? No, I'm not dropping anything.
Ah, they're just kids.
Just kids, huh?
Well, when you get a call that an officer's in trouble, it's more important. Let's go.
Can we go? We'll go right home.
Yeah.
No.
But yeah, I really love this movie, but I'll admit, a lot of my love for this movie really is just nostalgia. I have no idea how I'll actually feel about this movie if I saw it for the first time, like at the age I'm at now, but because I really grew up with this movie, it's a movie that's really close to my heart. And once again, I actually do think it's a really funny movie. Like, this is a definite horror comedy. Like, you have a lot of really funny scenes in this movie. Like, there's a scene in the movie where this hairstylist, who clearly doesn't want to be bothered, gets bothered by this stoner hippie guy, and the interaction between these two characters is really funny.
Oh my God.
Hi.
Obviously.
Are you a barber?
Do I look like a barber?
A hairstylist?
And of course, both those characters do eventually get eaten by the Blob. You also have another really funny scene in the movie where this guy who is like Russian or Eastern European, he's taking a bath and all of a sudden the Blob starts coming into his bathroom and he has to escape through his window, and he's running around the neighborhood naked, and he gets stopped by a cop, and the interaction between him and the cop is really funny.
You're just the man I want to see.
And you're just the man I want to see.
You'll never believe what I've seen.
I don't believe what I've seen. I don't suppose you got any identification. You get in the car, nature boy.
Also, the Blob effects in this movie are cheesy, but are also really cool looking at the same time. So yeah, I recommend Beware the Blob. I mean, I recommend it for the right kind of person. Like, don't be expecting a great movie, but I recommend it if you're a fan of cheesy horror comedies. I think you might enjoy it. But yeah, that was my review on Beware the Blob, and my next movie review will be on the 1988 remake of The Blob.
Here's what dude, you know he's feeling all right. In the morning, waking up in the ground, that Mr. Cocaine is bringing me down. Oh, tell me where to go, start breathing. I've been here before. Tell me where to go. Yeah, God, I've been here before. Yes, I have.
Oh, Randy, that was not a sight.